We are on chapter 13 of Mountains of Spices. And this chapter is entitled Craven Fear and Moody. And if you'll remember from Hind's Feet on High Places, Craven Fear was the young man that Much Afraid was supposed to marry, and instead she went up to the high places. And his aunt is Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, whom we now know has a new name, which I forgot. But anyway, she now has a new name because she has allowed the shepherd to come in. So, here we go. Chapter 13, Craven Fear and Moody. One morning very early, when Grace and Glory was walking near the pool and cascade where she had first kept tryst with the shepherd, she met her aunt Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and her cousin Gloomy. They were both wearing their beautiful garments of praise, and there was something so unusual and eager in their manner that Grace and Glory gazed at them in astonishment. That they were going to meet the shepherd at her old trysting place, she had no doubt. But the expression on their faces suddenly awakened her happy suspicions, and she could not restrain her curiosity. So, after greeting them affectionately, she said, "Where are you going at this early hour? For you look exactly as though you are starting on a journey." Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and Gloomy looked at each other and for a moment said nothing. For a journey to the high places is a secret affair and may not be paraded before others. Grace and Glory saw the look which passed between them and gave a joyful little laugh. "I know," she said, "but I will not ask you about it, for I know you are going with the shepherd, and that he has told you not to speak of it. But I wish you a good journey and a safe arrival at the high places. And oh, may you get there quicker than I did, and learn all the lessons on the way with joy instead of with fear and shrinking." Her aunt looked at her lovingly and gratefully, but she was still Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, and at the very beginning of the journey, and still without the right to a new name, so she answered, "Thank you, my dear. Yes, we are going with the shepherd, old and dreary as I am, and of as little use to him as I can expect to be. And though I'm afraid I'm too old to ever be able to develop Hind's feet, and to go prancing about as you do, Grace and Glory, yet the shepherd has promised to take me to the high places, and to give me a new name, and I know that I can trust him to do what he has promised." The look of love and trust which shone in her eyes as she spoke the last words made her suddenly appear so beautiful that Grace and Glory was filled with wonder. Her cousin Gloomy put both arms around her neck and kissed her twice without saying a word, then took her mother's hand, and on they went to the trysting place to meet the shepherd. Grace and Glory hurried toward the village, thinking of Spiteful left behind in the dreary attic. How would she manage now without the cheer of the daily visits of her sister and mother? What must she be feeling at being left behind? She found Spiteful, who was still weak and not yet fully recovered, moving about the miserable attic, and singing a little song with a look of wonderful peace and content upon her face. At first, Grace and Glory hardly knew what to say. "Did you meet my mother and Gloomy on your way here, dear Grace and Glory?" asked Spiteful, kissing her affectionately. "Yes," she answered. "I met them near the trysting place." Spiteful nodded. "Yes," she said happily. "They have gone with the shepherd. He is going to take them to the high places. It is too wonderful and lovely for words." Grace and Glory looked at her, still unable to say a word. "I know what you are thinking," said Spiteful with a gentle and understanding little smile. "You're wondering about me and how I can bear to be left behind in this attic." Grace and Glory nodded, still without speaking. Then Spiteful said softly, I couldn't go with them, because in a few days' time my husband will be coming out of prison, and there will be no one to welcome him or to care for him. But, Grace and Glory, the shepherd has told me that there is a way to the high places, even from this attic, and that though I cannot make the journey with my mother and sister, yet I may go there just as surely by this other way. So you see, I'm not left behind. Grace and Glory looked around the miserable attic where the wife of poor Moody, timid, skulking, was awaiting his return from prison, and suddenly she understood. She remembered the little golden flower, acceptance with joy, which she had found blooming in the wilderness, and the blood-red flower, bearing with love, or forgiveness, which grew in the prison house of the rocks and the great precipice. And she realized that they were growing here too, in this stifling attic, and that here indeed was a shortcut, steep and agonizing beyond anything which she herself had faced, but a real shortcut to the altar and the grave on the mountain on the very borders of the high places. She also understood that her cousin Spiteful, but how could she call her by that name again, was likely to arrive at the high places even before her mother and sister. She rose with a feeling of awe in her heart, and putting her arms around her cousin, said gently, "Cousin, when the shepherd told you about this shortcut to the high places, did he say anything to you about a new name?" Her cousin blushed a little and then said hesitatingly, "He said he would give me a new name while I wait here until my husband can go to the high places too. But the name would be just between himself and me. It was written on a little white stone which he gave me when he planted the seed of love in my heart. A new name which no one knows save she that receives the stone." "No one knows!" exclaimed Grace and Glory with a little tremble in her voice. "Why, that is very queer, for he has written it on your forehead for all to see. Didn't you know that?" "No," said her cousin wonderingly. "He gave me the white stone to carry in my heart, but he said nothing about a new name written on my forehead. What name is that, Grace and Glory?" "Why, it is one of his own names," said her cousin very softly. "He has marked you with the name Compassion." "That is a lovely, lovely name," said the girl who had been known as Spiteful. "That exactly expresses his attitude to me, but I don't think it is my name, Grace and Glory. I think it is just the mark of his own compassion and gentleness set there to show that I now belong to him." "Well," said her cousin after a little pause, "I certainly cannot call you by the old name any longer, and the name on the white stone is a secret between you and him, so I think we really must call you by the lovely name which is written for all to see on your forehead." Then she laughed a little and said, "Compassionate, I will sing you a song especially meant for attic dwellers." And she sang this song: "O thou afflicted, tempest-tossed, in sorrow's pathway led, behold thy suffering is not lost, thou shalt be comforted. In fairest colors thou shalt shine, and precious jewels shall be thine. Foundation stones of bright sapphires shall garnish all thy floors. Thy ruby windows glow like fires, and emeralds make thy doors. And all thy walls and borders be of precious stones and porphyry. Fear not, thy trust ends not in loss. I'll not put thee to shame. There is a purpose in thy cross, and no reproach and blame. One day, with glad, exultant voice, thou child of sorrow shalt rejoice." Stretch forth the curtains of thy tent, lengthen the cords, spread wide. Strengthen thy stakes with great content, break forth on every side. Thine anguish is no barren birth, thou shalt receive. Thou shalt have seed through all the earth. That's from Isaiah 54:11 and 12. What a lovely song, exclaimed Compassionate, and her eyes were shining like jewels of the song. Where did you learn it, Grace and Glory? The shepherd taught it to me on the way up to the high places, and I wrote it down after I got up there. Why is it called a song for attic dwellers? Asked Compassionate. Where else could it possibly sung with greater meaning and effect? Asked her cousin with a laugh. It has all the force and beauty of contrast and all the glory of promise and fulfillment. Sing it again, begged Compassionate. Sing it over and over again until I have learned it by heart. So, Grace and Glory taught her cousin the attic song, just as Sorrow had taught her the song about the hind's feet when she was limping on the mist-shrouded mountains. And as they sang, the dreadful little attic really did seem to undergo a transformation before their very eyes. It seemed to sparkle with glittering jewels as though it were a room in a palace, and the bare, ugly walls appeared to have melted away, leaving only a vista of royal gardens and orchards. After they had sung it over and over again until Compassionate knew it by heart, Grace and Glory set about preparing a little midday meal for them both, and as she did so, the two talked together about many things. Grace and Glory promised that she would visit her cousin every day, and Compassionate accepted the offer with overflowing joy and gratitude. As it turned out, there was a special reason for this. Grace and Glory, she said, speaking slowly and rather hesitatingly, but with great earnestness. If you are willing, I would like for you to help me with something. With all my heart, answered Grace and Glory gladly. In any way that I can. There is nothing that I should like more. Then, went on Compassionate with a little flush on her cheeks, I will tell you what I have been thinking and hoping. You know that my husband is coming out of prison in a few days' time, and I am waiting to receive him. For poor and miserable as the attic is, and terribly close to temptation as, alas, it also is, it is the only refuge which he has in all the world. I shall be here to do all that I can for him. And as she spoke, her face flushed with tender love, and she seemed to have forgotten completely how weak she was, and how utterly unfit to do anything. But, she went on, looking at her cousin entreatingly, but dear Grace and Glory, my brother Craven Fear is to leave prison on the same day as my husband, and he has nowhere to go. I have no room for him in this tiny attic. Neither would Mrs. Murmuring allow him to come here. They will take my poor husband back to be their drudge, but not Craven. I know, dear Grace and Glory, how much you have suffered at the hands of my brother, and how you have never been able to bear him, but oh, I cannot bear to think of his coming out of prison with no one to meet him or to speak a gentle, loving word toward him, with nowhere to go, and made to feel that no one in the wide world will have anything to do with him. My mother and Gloomy are not here to take him home, and the cottage is shut up. The shepherd himself chose to take them away just at this time, so it must be right. And much as I long to go to meet him, I am still unable to leave the attic. Dearest Grace and Glory, you are our nearest relative. Would you feel able and willing to go to the prison to meet them both? And could you perhaps arrange with Mrs. Valiant or one of the shepherd's other friends to let poor Craven have a room until he can find work and feels ready to face the world again? She broke off, trembling and sobbing, and instantly Grace and Glory was kneeling beside her with a radiant face and saying, "Oh, compassionate, what a lovely thought that is. You don't know how I have longed to be able to do something for poor Craven, almost more than for anyone else. I have received so much, and he is so utterly destitute and miserable. Of course I will go. With all my heart, I will go to welcome them both. Craven is your brother and my cousin and my closest relative. But oh, compassionate, do you know the thought that came to me while you were speaking? It really is too lovely for words. I'm sure it came straight from the shepherd himself." And she laughed joyfully as she spoke. "What is it?" asked Compassionate eagerly and with hope dawning in her eyes. "Why, it came to me that there is your mother's cottage standing empty and all ready to be used. You don't want your husband to come here to this attic in the inn where he will have to encounter such temptation every time he comes and goes, and where he will never be out of reach of his worst enemy, drink. But see, I will take joy and peace, and we will go and spring clean your mother's cottage from top to bottom and make it all ready. And oh, compassionate, you can leave this attic right away. The song is beginning to come true at once, and you and Moody and Craven can all live there together. I will come along every day, and the other friends of the shepherd will help. I know, and I will help you with the meals and the work, and you three can be together in your own home. Oh, compassionate, you will certainly get better ever so much more quickly as soon as you get out of this oven-like attic, and your husband will be away from temptation." A flush of lovely color had flooded into Compassionate's cheeks, and her eyes began to shine like stars at the very mention of such a plan. But she hesitated wistfully. "Oh, Grace and Glory, it sounds too lovely, almost like the high places themselves. To think of being home again, and out of this place of terrible temptation. But how shall we manage? We must earn something, you know, and this is the only work we can do, poor Moody and I. I do the mending for Murmuring, and he will do all the rough jobs about the premises." She sighed heavily as she spoke, and the color faded again from her cheeks. "Murmuring will never leave us as long as she can get work out of us for almost nothing." "No, no," exclaimed Grace and Glory. "You can never be meant to stay here, just existing in penury and at the expense of poor Moody's safety. No, never. We will ask the shepherd and his friends. There must be some way in which you can support yourselves, and Craven too, without being dependent on the shepherd's enemies. I believe, too, that Bitterness will be willing to help you move, indeed to help in any way he can, in order to make some sort of atonement to you, for he is utterly wretched over the misery and suffering you have undergone since you came to live and work here. Leave it to me, Compassionate. We won't say a word to Murmuring, but I will speak to Bitterness and enlist his aid. Meanwhile, I will get dear Mrs. Valiant and Mercy to help me prepare the cottage for you. Indeed, we won't waste a moment. Did your mother leave the key with you? Yes, that's good. Let me have it, and we will set to work at once. And you, meantime, as you are able, can begin gathering together your things and packing what you need to take with you. Oh, cousin, I am so happy. I feel as though I can't contain the joy, but must burst with it. To think of it, a home for you and your husband, and for my cousin Craven. I can help to make it ready and can go and meet them and bring them to it. Could anything be lovelier? The two women kissed each other with inexpressible joy and thanksgiving, and then Grace and Glory sped on her way, first to the home of Mrs. Valiant, then to Mercy, and then to the deserted cottage of the widow. Dismal forebodings. Such a transformation the three women and their friends worked in the cottage and in the garden overgrown with weeds as scarcely can be imagined. Fearless Trust, one of the shepherds who was courting Mercy, and some of his friends dug up the garden, burned the weeds, planted the beds with vegetables and flowers, and painted the cottage. The women scoured and cleaned the rooms, sewed curtains, washed linen, repaired and arranged the furnishings, and joyfully contributed from their own stores the articles needed to restock the linen and china cupboards and to beautify the rooms. Within a week, it was the neatest, fairest, coziest cottage in the village, and the cupboards were stocked with supplies, loaves and pies and jellies and fruits and vegetables and a host of other good things. Mrs. Valiant had brought over some fowls, and her future son-in-law had built a fine run and chicken coop. Then Compassionate was taken to the cottage and installed there with great rejoicings, and everything was ready for the reception of her husband and brother the following day. Her closest friends gathered round her that evening. She looked a different woman already in her great joy at escaping from the miserable attic and having a home of her own. As she sat in the porch with her cousin, Grace and Glory, and her friends, Mrs. Valiant, Mercy, and Fearless Trust, they talked over their plans and hopes, yes, and still more, their fears for the morrow, for fears there were. They went over every point again and again and tried to comfort one another. But would it be possible, they asked one another, to persuade the two men to return to the village where their shame and disgrace were known to everybody? What would they say when they found themselves surrounded by the shepherd's friends? How could they be weaned away from their old associates? Above all, from the tormenting slavery of drink. It was one thing to prepare and make ready for their return with all the joy of love. But how could the two men be persuaded to enter into and accept the things which love had prepared for them? Suppose they refused to come, as now seemed all too possible. Suppose they had made other plans while in prison, and meant to take off and hide themselves among the teeming multitudes in the city of destruction, and so be lost beyond recovery. Compassionate and Grace and Glory shivered at the bare possibility of such a thing. Fearless Trust bit his lips and moved restlessly, and even Mrs. Valiant seemed to have nothing definite to suggest. Then there was the problem also as to who should go to meet them at the prison. If Grace and Glory went alone, they might ignore her and just march off and leave her. Whereas if too many went, and of course all of them were the shepherd's friends, whom the two men had always despised and disliked, either they might be frightened away or else made hopelessly self-conscious and more determined than ever to go their own way. Oh, if only the shepherd were there to tell them what to do. In the midst of their perplexity and doubt and longing, they looked up, and there he was, standing beside them. With inexpressible joy and thankfulness, they welcomed him and told him the whole situation. What were they to do? How could they win these weak and miserable men upon whom all their hearts were now set with compassionate longing and love? As soon as they had finished pouring out all their doubts and fears, the shepherd said quietly, Grace and Glory is to go to the prison because she is their nearest relative. Mrs. Valiant shall go with her also because she is motherly and understanding and unsentimental, and she will neither sob nor bemoan them. Then he added, and my friend, Bitterness, will drive you both over to the prison in his car and bring you all back here to the cottage. There was a moment of almost stupefied silence following these last words, and then Mrs. Valiant said in a tone of quite indescribable satisfaction. Your friend, Bitterness? Aha! So at last you have won him. Bitterness has decided to give up the public house business altogether, said the shepherd, and to take service with me. We have not yet persuaded his wife, Murmuring, to do the same thing, and at present she is going to continue to run the business as her own concern. Meanwhile, Bitterness feels that on him lies a great part of the blame for the disgrace and shame into which Moody and Craven have fallen, and he is anxious to make all amends possible and to help them. At this stage, I believe he is just the man to be able to persuade them both to come home to the village. And so it was settled. Next morning, early, Bitterness arrived at the cottage with Mrs. Valiant, Grace, and Glory, and Mercy, who was to help Compassionate with all her loving plans and contrivances for welcoming home the prodigals. After leaving her at the cottage, the others drove off to the prison. Thus it came to pass that when Craven Fear and Moody found the great prison gates at last open to let them out, and were preparing to slink away and lose themselves in the labyrinth of city streets as soon as possible, they found the chosen three waiting to meet them. Mrs. Valiant, with her beaming motherly face, Grace and Glory, and the tall, burly figure of Bitterness, the proprietor of the inn, in much trembling. Bitterness stepped forward first, and seizing Moody's hand in his, said in a voice of gruff kindness, tinged with sincere shame, "Moody, my dear fellow, I am thankful to see you again. I blame myself almost entirely for all that has happened, and beg you to let me make any amends in my power, and to help you now in every way I can." At the same moment, Grace and Glory stepped quietly up to Craven Fear, and placing her hands on his shoulders, kissed him gently on both cheeks, but found herself unable to utter a single word. Good Mrs. Valiant, however, bustled forward, and was so cheery and matter-of-fact, as though she were merely greeting and welcoming them home from a journey, that the two men found it impossible to be stubborn and resistant, and before they quite knew what was happening, Moody was seated on the front seat of the car beside Bitterness, and Craven Fear was wedged between his cousin and Mrs. Valiant on the back seat. That remarkable lady was soon chatting away cheerfully, telling them all the news of the village, not waiting for any remarks or answers which she knew quite well would not be forthcoming. So they came to the cottage and to the little homely feast which Mercy had prepared for them, and to the gentle, loving welcome of Compassionate, who received her husband and brother as though they were in very truth the joy and satisfaction of her heart. Undoubtedly, it was the presence of Bitterness, the once domineering man, who was now so changed and humble, which made the return possible, and prevented the two men from bolting from the cottage and the village as soon as the meal was over. There was something so sincere and touching in his obvious remorse and desire to make amends, and in the way in which he took his place alongside them, sharing the blame and disgrace, and planning with them how all three of them could start afresh, that in the end they could not resist him, and both finally agreed to stay for some days at least, albeit with apparent sullenness and unwillingness. If any other influence had worked upon Craven Fear, he gave no sign of it, but only sat in stubborn silence, whether surly or ashamed, it was hard to say. Every now and then, however, he raised his eyes furtively and looked around the transformed room, at the gentle light shining in the eyes of his sister as she sat beside her husband, at the handsome, pleading face of the repentant Bitterness, at the kind face of Mercy, as she deftly served them, and once and again almost covertly at his cousin, who sat nearly as silent as himself on the other side of the table. The girl who had once been ugly and crippled, whom he had tormented again and again since she was a tiny child, and who in the end ran away to escape marrying him. Now, here she was, sitting with him in the cottage, which was so completely transformed he hardly recognized it as the same dreary place where they had all lived together, and she, too, was incredibly transformed. Only once did she say anything that evening, and that was after Bitterness had told them of his plans for starting anew in business, and had pleaded with them both to stay and work with him. Craven Fear, looking covertly across the table, saw that his cousin's eyes were filled with tears and that they were turned upon him, and he heard her whisper, "Oh, Craven, you will stay, won't you?" He made no answer, but sat with his great oversized body slouched in the chair, looking as though wild horses would not drag a word out of his lips. But he stayed. Later that night, in the room familiar since childhood, now so lovingly rearranged and in such great contrast to the prison cell which had housed him for many months, with no one to see or hear, the great hulking man laid himself face down on the bed and sobbed like a little child. A few days later, the shepherd, sitting at midnight among his sheep in the shade of some great trees, looked up and saw the huge, slouching figure of Craven Fear coming across the field toward him. Never before had this man approached the shepherd of his own free will, but now he came, hesitatingly it is true, but with a certain dogged determination toward the one from whom many a time he had fled, the one who in the end had been the cause of his imprisonment. The shepherd sat quietly, looking steadily at him as he stumbled forward, his eyes downcast, his face and hands twitching nervously. Finally, he stood before the one he had never dared to look in the face. Then he bent his huge form and knelt in the dust in silence. Neither spoke a word. At last, Craven lifted his eyes and blurted out, "Sir, if you will, you can make me different." "I will indeed," said the shepherd in a strong, clear voice. Your name now is Craven Fear, but you shall be called Fearless Witness, and you shall be my messenger and suffer many things for my sake." When Craven Fear left the place under the trees where he had entered the shepherd's service, he went straight back to the cottage and sought out his brother-in-law. He found him in the little backyard, drearily chopping wood. "Moody," said Craven Fear, going up to him, "come with me." "Where to?" asked Moody, looking at him as though he were a ghost. "To the shepherd," said Craven Fear simply. "He can do everything for you that needs doing." "The shepherd?" gasped Moody, and cringed away backward. "What do you mean, Craven? I shan't go to him. Why, the first thing that he would say is that I must give up the drink, and I can't. I can't live without the stuff, and what's more, I can't stand this life in the cottage without it any longer." "That's just what I mean," said Craven. "You can't manage without him any longer, and neither can I. Come with me. I'll take you straight to him. I know where he is now at this moment." "He won't be able to do anything for me," wailed Moody miserably, cringing further away from his brother. "It's no good in my listening to you, Craven. You're stronger, and he may be able to help you, but I am too weak for him to be able to do anything with." "Well, you don't need to listen to me," said Craven patiently but doggedly. "Just come and see him for yourself and hear what he says about it." And with all that, he put out one of his huge hands and laid it firmly on the shoulder of his trembling brother-in-law. It was one thing for Craven to say, "You don't need to listen to me," but quite another for Moody to avoid doing so. For Craven was almost a giant, head and shoulders taller than most of the men in the valley, and possessed of great strength, which he had been accustomed to exert to the utmost during his bouts of bullying. Now, when for the first time he was engaged on a really good job, he had no idea at all of employing less strength and effort to do so that the shrinking Moody found himself propelled forward quite irresistibly by the heavy and powerful arm of his brother-in-law. Off he had to go, whether he wished or no, for there was no escaping that powerful brotherly arm. Thus it came about that a little later the shepherd beheld the figure of the man he had just taken into his service, who was later to become known far and wide as Fearless Witness, pushing toward him the shrinking figure of the timid Moody. And if, at the sight, there was something very like a smile on the shepherd's lips, there was also upon his face a look of indescribable joy and satisfaction. Moody, looking up at last and catching sight of that expression, suddenly stopped trembling and resisting and stepped forward of his own free will. "Sir," said Craven Fear, planting the little man before the shepherd and keeping his huge arm around the bowed shoulders. "Sir, I've brought you my brother. He is not nearly so bad a man as I am, but he too needs your help and power." Moody again raised his eyes toward the face which was turned to him, and meeting the understanding and compassionate look of the shepherd, blurted out in a faint, trembling voice, "Sir, I am the slave of an unclean spirit. Can you cast it out and deliver me?" "Most certainly," said the shepherd, and he laid his hands on him and said, "I make you free. And when the Son makes you free, you are free indeed." Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his shalom.